Welcome to my review of Super Castlevania 4 for the Super Nintendo. And yeah, this game has passwords, so you can always start from, the general area where you last got to. I don't remember. You might have to start back at the beginning. Like, you see how the levels are divided up into sections, like 1-1, 1-2, 1-3, 1-4 in the upper left corner. That kind of thing. I think if you exhaust your current lives, which it says P equals 4, that's how many lives you have. If you exhaust all your lives, I believe you're sent back to the beginning of the last stage you got to. So if you're on like 1-4 and you lose all your lives, you'll probably be sent back to 1-1. And then when you make it to 2-1, that'll be the next stage. So that'll be where your password will start you from. So you get a password for each new full stage. You know what I mean? Not the sections, but the actual new stage, if that makes any sense. So the game is very forgiving in that regard, whereas, with Castlevania 1, the original, obviously, you had to either beat it in one sitting or leave the system on, that type of thing, if you're playing on an actual console. But, of course, with the Super Nintendo, it was a new console generation, and with each new console generation, games, on average, got a little bit easier, and it still carries through to this day. I've seen that since the beginning. I'm going back to Atari 2600, which didn't really have beatable games too often. But if you want to start from an era that mostly had beatable games that were clearly beatable with endings and everything, not just score games, starting with like the NES era onward, and then you went to the Genesis and Super Nintendo era, and then from that you go into PlayStation 1 and 64. Games just got easier with each console generation, on average, I would say. That's something I've always noticed. And games now, of course, on default difficulty are mostly a joke, I would say, for someone who's been playing for a long time. I don't mean for beginning players, but remember, beginning players in the NES era had a much harder time trying to get into these games because there was not a lot of information available. There was no internet. And games were just much, much fucking harder on average. So most of the NES games that I owned as a kid, I couldn't beat them or get very far in them, but I love the system. It kind of added to the mystique for me of the games. And it probably got me into games even more, that whole challenge and mystery of not being able to see the full game. It was just a different time. But aside from all that, this game, is still from that era. It still carries over those attributes from the 8-bit era. But it kind of goes up in the next step with the password system, giving you, a little bit more leniency so you can kind of build your confidence and get moving in a direction towards beating the game a little bit easier. So, and I actually like that. I like games with passwords and shit. I don't really like having to redo the entire game, but, sometimes I'm in the mood to put together a brutal fucking game and learn it from the beginning on limited continues, and sometimes I kind of enjoy the penalties because it kind of, forces me to really learn a game and master it. So that it can be cool. I'm not against it at all, but I do really like games with good checkpoints and passwords and stuff like that, so that maybe you only need to learn one stage instead of learning the entire game. It's always a welcome thing for me. That's my preference, really. I prefer checkpoint to checkpoint gameplay, even with extreme modes in games like Master Ninja and Ninja Gaiden Black and stuff like that. I like being able to go back to my last save point, as opposed to having to redo a huge game, or even these shorter, older games. Restarting the whole game can be kind of punishing for sure and frustrating. So when given the choice, most of the time, unless I'm looking for a little extra punishment, I go for checkpoint to checkpoint stuff. Most of the time. But yeah, this is a great game. Like I said, it has passwords, so you don't have to go back too far. You just have to learn each stage. So you might have to learn 8 sections in a stage or whatever it is. Now, I beat this a few years ago again. And this was from my tutorial version that I made just for the channel. So when I went through this, and I put this in the description, I'm always very transparent about my playthroughs. I did this playthrough strictly for the tutorial, not to add to my games beaten list, because I beat this game many years ago when it was current. So for that version, I made save states on the beginning of sections a lot of times, and then I reloaded the state on the beginning of the section so I could learn each section, and I posted that footage. So I wasn't redoing the whole thing, the way that you would normally do it. I made my own checkpoints, basically. So it was a lot faster for me to put this together, and it wasn't real thorough. It wasn't a real refined tutorial like some of the ones that I do. It was a little sloppy. I didn't master each section or anything. I've done no damage tutorials like with Ninja Gaiden 3 for NES. I did the whole game, no damage, each section with no damage. And that was extra footage that I got by doing each section with save states at the beginning of the section. I didn't make save states in the middle of the section or anything. I wasn't going to be that cheap about it, but I did make them at the beginning of each section, just for demonstration purposes, to show how a clean execution would look, basically. And that's kind of what, that's partially what I did with this, except I didn't refine it. I didn't try to get no damage or anything like that. I just pretty much tried to do the sections decently, and that was about it. But I will post up that tutorial. There'll be a link in the description as well. And I don't really have a completion time on this because I wouldn't consider my tutorial, creating the tutorial for this, I wouldn't consider that a legit completion. So I don't really document that. I beat the game years ago, way before I would keep track of how many hours the game took me. Of course, it was hard to do that back then because there were no real recording tools easily, Unless maybe I was going to try to set up a VHS tape or something. I don't even know if I had a fucking VCR back then. Probably did, but you'd have to have like 2 VCRs to transfer the recordings, and it was a lot less feasible, and you couldn't post the recording anywhere or save it online or put it on a computer or anything, so there wasn't a lot of incentive. But it's a challenging game. I would say it's easier than a lot of the other Castlevania games because of the passwords do make it easier, and overall I don't feel like it's as challenging overall as, say Castlevania 1. But Castlevania 1's really not, I don't find it to be that hard. It's a challenging game to me mainly because of that Grim Reaper fight. But the rest of the game to me wasn't really that hard. And I know it's notorious for being an extremely difficult game, but, compared to a lot of the crazy shit that I've played through, I would say it's more on the moderate end with, just a really hard, one single really difficult section, which is the Grim Reaper, which I still find that to be hard, going in there without the holy water. So, the boss fights are great. They're all really enjoyable. And this game really excels in the atmosphere. I think it has the best atmosphere of any of the Castlevania games, because of the music and the visuals. I like that you can rotate the whip, full 360 degrees. You can rotate the whip around. It's not super useful, but sometimes you can use it to block attacks, which is kind of an interesting mechanic. I think it's the only Castlevania game that carried that over. If it wasn't any of the other ones, it's hard to remember because there were so many different Castlevania games, and I played through most of them, aside from some of the 3D Castlevania games. But as far as like the side scrollers, I've gone through pretty much all of them except maybe Castlevania 3 for NES, which is one that I was working on. I got to finish that. But yeah, this is my favorite one. And I know that's not a real popular opinion. I don't hear this one get as much praise as the other games by a lot of people, but for me, this is my favorite one. I enjoyed not only the gameplay of it the most, but I just like the atmosphere a lot, and that definitely goes a long way for me. But I do feel like the gameplay is some of the best because of the way it uses the whip to swing. You can use the whip to swing around and platform, and you have just the way the levels are laid out. I just felt like the layouts were even better than some of the older NES games. I thought this was definitely for me the superior Castlevania game as far as these 2D side scroll Castlevania is my favorite one. So I do regard this one really highly. And it's definitely a good challenge. It presents a good challenge. It's though if you have trouble with Castlevania games in general, this is probably a good one to start with because I think it's one of the easier ones from what I remember. Now, don't get me wrong; it definitely has some hard parts, and if you're not, if you're not decently skilled with platformers in these type of games, then it's going to give you a lot of trouble. But if you're trying to tackle Castlevania games, this is probably a good one to start with as far as they go because this is probably one of the easiest ones. It's a pretty hard series overall, so this still can be a hard game, no doubt. So yeah, this is the final fight against Dracula. There's a lot of boss fights in the game. You have bosses at the end of each stage, and there's a lot of stages. I believe there's over 12 stages or something like that. And each stage, has a lot of sections in it. So it's a pretty long game. I don't remember the exact length of a playthrough, like if you don't die. Because like when I played it, of course, I died. And of course, I was making it for the tutorial, so I wasn't playing by strict rules. So it's hard for me to give a completion time of how long it took me to beat. I try to do that whenever I have the information available. It gives players who are following the channel can give them an idea of what to expect, how hard the game may be, how long it may take to finish. It's also just information that I document myself because I like to look back on the games and how long they took to beat. But yeah, the final boss is not too difficult. It's just some pattern practicing and getting used to the movement. Taking out the flames to give yourself some room. It definitely takes some practice. It's a fairly challenging fight, but it's not brutal or anything like that. The game as a whole, really, it doesn't have any single parts that are brutally difficult. There's no parts in the game that are as difficult as the Reaper from the NES version. And I did a tutorial on that NES version as well, where I do a no damage run of the Grim Reaper with I think just the single cross, without any major power ups or anything. So you may want to check that out. But yeah, there's nothing in this game that's that difficult, but it can still be challenging. But the gameplay is really well done. I like the mix of platforming with the combat, as usual in the Castlevania games. Now it does have a really rigid jump. Once you jump, you launch your jump, you are committed to the trajectory of that jump. So there's no adjusting your jump distance or anything like that. But that's very common for the old Castlevania games. The only control improvement over the NES games in this game is the ability to like move your whip around. You can kind of just hold the whip there and just jerk it around, say like that. And that's really probably the only control improvement that was added since the NES games. Now, this game doesn't have the ability to switch characters like Castlevania 3 added, which is a cool ability, definitely. And it would have been cool, but I think the game maintains its style by just having the one character. It's real well balanced around that one character. The levels are really well designed, and I think the platforming is better done in a lot of the older games. Like I said, with the whip swinging, and just the overall design of the levels, I felt was better. So for me, I'd give this game an 8.5 out of 10. Thanks for watching. Let me know if you have any questions.